Hey folks, my name is Raquel Rossetti. I'm a 3D artist for film and games, and in this video I will break down the texturing process of my night crocodile in Mari. This project was created as a demo piece during my time at the VFX training at Pixel Vision in Cologne. I had a lot of fun with it and learned a lot about the Mari workflow, so I hope some of my insights might be helpful for your projects too. So without further ado, let's dive right in. To give a quick overview before we dive into Mari, I created a simple base mesh in ZBrush focusing on the main shapes. Little disclaimer, this is just a quick recreation of the steps. I wanted to recreate a specific species, which meant that my research had to be quite thorough to begin with. I kept my references close by to keep an overview of all the areas I need to cover throughout the process. One part was mainly focusing on anatomy, later I added more references for color and texture detail. The topology and UVs were then once the anatomy looked right. This included stretching out the legs to make it easier to rig and animate them later. I wanted to keep the mesh quite low poly and the UV layout fairly simple. If your project requires very close-up macro shots, you definitely want to lay out the UVs accordingly, giving each part more UV space. While there was still some hand sculpting I had to do later, I wanted to make use of some beautiful texturing XYZ maps. This is when we finally get to Mari. Here I could upload my low poly mesh and set up my node tree to create a first base for my displacement map. For the shader I added an 8K channel with a solid gray base at 0.5. This is to ensure that my displacement EXRs can be imported and rendered properly. And on top I added a paint node on which I could project my maps on. The maps I used were for the backstrap and the belly. The process of projecting is pretty straightforward, really just creating nodes like you would layers, and painting, or in our case projecting the detailed map onto the mesh. I was able to project several parts of the body like this. For some other parts of the crocodile I had to use a few different methods. This was my final node tree for the displacement map. Each paint node for their own part of the body. Specifically for the limbs I didn't have to write maps or alphas to recreate my reference precisely. That's why I left out the front legs for my sculpt later, but I could build up the texture for the hind legs scale by cropping very small patches from my bigger projection maps directly inside Mari. This is done by just dragging over an area and clicking on the crop symbol in the top left. The new cropped images will instantly appear in the image manager. The head of a crocodile has also very distinct cracks and cavities. I looked for a good reference photo for those, uploaded it into my image manager and put it in grayscale by clicking on the filter menu in the top bar and selecting hue. Here I zeroed out the saturation, changed the values and clicked apply. I projected the new image mainly onto the jaw and mouth area to get a rough idea of the detail placement. I wasn't able to use this method as a final displacement, but it gave me enough of a rough base to sculpt over and enhance the shapes and cavities later in ZBrush, where I would also manually sculpt in the rest of the skin breakage and scales. So what you see here is not a final displacement, but more of a guide. With my Mari displacement ready, I went back to ZBrush and imported the map to my subdivided mesh. A huge time saver during this step of the process was Jake Harrell's UDIM Importer plugin, a great tool that lets you import all your UDIMs to ZBrush at once. To get my final high poly sculpt, I did some polishing in ZBrush and sculpted all the aforementioned details I didn't have a map or alpha for. That included the cavities on the top of the head, the area around the eyes, and the front legs. With my Mari displacement on my sculpt layers, I gave the scales more volume and enhanced the overall shapes. Once done, I was able to bake my final displacement map and other utility maps that would be necessary for texturing. Back in Mari, I'm replacing my low poly mesh with my decimation for a better showcase. But at the beginning of the texturing process, you would probably stick with the low poly and display the wireframe to see where you paint on. This was my node setup. I broke down my base into main skin, eyes, teeth and claws with the help of isolation masks. This way I could focus on the specific parts. The most work went into the skin, of course. I kept the merges down here, all the colors and tilables above, and here I have my secondary isolation masks. He started out with a few masks just for blocking some areas with color or pattern variation. During the process, this area grew with more detailed masks. The main paintwork actually is in black and white. Masking allows for the most flexibility. I can easily go back and forth, changing my color or adding or erasing areas. To keep everything organized, I heavily relied on broadcaster and receiver nodes. And in case you are wondering, to get a vertical view of the nodes, just use Shift and S. With the base prepared, I started building the diffuse color from the ground up. I started with a base color, a belly color, and a blocked out belly mask. Since nature isn't perfectly clean and smooth, it helps to add tile texture maps and triplanar projections early on. It can be anything that breaks up my base color. This map was originally a rust pattern, but with the help of HSL nodes and soft light merging, it turned into a nice color breakup. I continued with blocking out more areas according to my references. I added more desaturated areas on the head and overlaid another tileable texture to get more surface variation. Now I had a generic base skin to build upon. Then I added a yellow gradient on the side of the body. When I needed a softer transition between the sides and the belly, I could go back to my mask and edit it accordingly. The texture breakup with tileables can only get so far. So here's when I needed my geochannel and utility maps to continue for more details. These maps are all in extra sections of my isolation masks. My curvature and cavity maps needed the most tweaks. The cavity map is one of the most important maps to really sell your creature with scales. It helps to get a better feel for the scale placement, the colorations, and adds a lot to the final look. With all the scales and different folds here, it easily could look too cartoony. It helps to check in look depth what works best. That is why I did some experimenting, mixing a ZBrush cavity with other bakes and hand-painted areas as seen here. Some parts need more prominent cavities, while others need finer, less dark lines to convey the texture the crocodile skin has. I added some darker valleys here and then the darker cavities. Then I continued with breaking up the general surface even more with the respective masks. For the colors, I added more tileables and controlled the intensity with each merge node on the main branch. The merges were masked by grunge maps on peaks and valleys. Some masks are mainly based on my baked geochannel maps, while others combine Marii's internal noise maps. The base color slowly gets built up this way, adding more and more color variation from tiny details to obvious spots and stripes, or making the palms darker or the mouth brighter. Here's an example of how I combined my geochannel maps with Marii's noise maps for this procedural breakup along the scales. I have my baked curvature here, enhanced the contrast, inverted it, and created this inverted border effect by playing with the brightness lookup graph. I masked out the belly and finally added a turbulence noise to give me this organic result. This works for big random surface breakups as well as specific details. For example, one feature of a crocodile that can easily be overlooked are these little spots on their faces. Since I had already sculpted these spots, I baked a curvature mask with only the spots as detail, breaking up the shape with merging a noise map and manually refining the map. Here I got my dots, and with adding a brightness lookup node, I could add a border around each spot to finalize the look of the crocodile spots. When I focused on the mouth area later, I figured that I needed even more spots and used a more non-destructive approach with a dotted texture. This allowed me to make changes along the way without having to rebake anything. On this note, a shout out to a great in-depth tutorial by Zach Boxall on creature texturing. It covers a lot more tips and tricks, which also helped me during my process. With all the possibilities of adding details with procedural maps or painting masks, I need to mention another very valuable and powerful feature of Marii의, which is simply taking a real reference image and projecting parts of that onto your creature. Personally, I wouldn't overuse real imagery, because a non-destructive approach allows for more flexibility. But it can enhance some areas. I tried this with parts of the backstrap, for example, after the main work on the colors was done. It had already a great base, but it was very satisfying to let the photographs merge into my base color. I just cut out the single scales I wanted to use and used projection and a warp tool. It didn't even have to be a high-resolution picture, it just shouldn't be pixelated. The same approach was used for the teeth and claws. Projecting reference images, adding tileables to my base color, and blending with my color through masks. For the eyes, I used another texture that I just refined and edited according to my reference. For the final polish of the base color, I had to think about the creature and its environment holistically, because every texture detail gives some story and context to your asset. Every detail has a purpose, and it will add to the realism at the end. You want to look for color variation, scars, scratches, and also environmental impacts. For example, I needed to add more breakup on the bright belly where the crocodile would rub on the rocks and dirt. Same with the gums, where the rest of its meals and other dirt may settle in the front part, while its throat is just naturally exposing more of a fleshy color and less residue. This is nicely achieved by masking out the dirt texture with merging a cavity mask with painted patches. Also on other parts, I continued with more dirt, partially painting with an organic brush, but also cloud and noise maps. With my references close by, I could always check what kind of details are common and which colors or shades make sense. With my base color finished, I could proceed to the next maps. To prevent Mari from getting too slow, it's worth to mention that you can add a bake node so that your process so far is set and caged. Now for my final result, I actually mainly needed a roughness and a subsurface scattering map. For the roughness, I took my base color and put it in grayscale. This is not the most elegant method, but it gives a quick first detailed roughness pass that can be refined later on. I had to check my look diff to see what works and what doesn't. Some areas needed more specularity and some less. Your roughness map doesn't need too much detail right away, however using the base color or your displacement map for your roughness map helps to add surface variety directly. Sometimes the areas which have more or less specularity might not make sense and need to be edited though. Similarly, the subsurface scattering map was a rarer version of the base color, with a mask that was a mix of hand painting and thickness map. At this stage you need to test out a lot to really nail the look depth. It also depends on your scenery. Was the crocodile in water or just getting out? Was it sunbathing and dry and dirty? When I decided on a swamp area, I would go back and add even more mud and dry dirt crusts on the base color, or add more black areas in the roughness map. So after a lot of testing, I was finally happy with my maps and focused on my final look depth and scenery in Arnold. For this, my peers helped me with the rig and the set dressing of the Quixel assets. And for the final render, I used Nuke to do some editing, color grading, and add final touches like chromatic aberration and so on. This is the result. All in all, I had a lot of fun with this process. There's so much more to cover and show for a project like this, but I hope you enjoyed this little behind the scenes. And if you haven't had the chance to check out Mari and node-based texturing yet, I hope this making of showed you that it might seem overwhelming at first, but once you get into it, it starts to make sense and you can get really cool results. Thanks for checking out my Nile Crocodile breakdown. I hope you had fun watching, and take care.